In a high-pressure classroom moment, the teacher forces a Mexican student to solve a difficult equation, unaware that behind his calm demeanor lies a true math genius ready to astonish everyone. The courtroom fell silent as Miguel Rodriguez approached the witness stand. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his face. At 32, he looked a decade older, her once vibrant eyes now hollow pools reflecting years of carefully guarded pain. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the wooden rail. "Ms. Vasquez," the prosecutor began, her voice cutting through the silence. "Can you identify the defendant?" Elena's gaze shifted to the defense table, where Professor Matthews sat in an impeccable gray suit, his expression a calculated mask of concern. Their eyes met, and for a fraction of a second his facade cracked, revealing a flicker of the cold calculation she remembered all too well. "Yes," Elena answered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the storm brewing inside her chest. "That's him," the prosecutor approached, nodding encouragingly. "And can you tell us about your relationship with Mr. Lambert?" Elena swallowed hard. 3 years of silence were about to end. 3 years of nightmares, therapy sessions, and rebuilding herself from the shattered pieces he'd left behind. She glanced at the gallery where her younger brother Carlos sat, eyes brimming with a mixture of pride and concern. Beside her was Principal Ramirez, the only person who had believed her when everyone else had turned away. "He was my math teacher at Westfield High School," Elena began, each word carefully measured. "And he systematically destroyed my career, my reputation, and nearly my life." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Lambert's attorney leaned forward, ready to object, but Lambert placed a restraining hand on his arm, that practiced smile never leaving his lips. "Take your time, Ms. Vasquez," the judge said kindly. Elena took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Alvarez's breathing techniques. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. This testimony could finally bring Lambert to justice or condemn her to be forever labeled as unstable, vindictive, a liar. 3 other women had come forward after she'd broken her silence, but Elena's testimony was the cornerstone of the case. Without it, everything would crumble. "I was student at Meridian," she continued. "I had worked there for 7 years, built a reputation, earned my position." Her voice grew stronger with each word. Then Mr. Lambert was brought in as the new math teacher. From the corner of her eye, Elena saw Marisol give an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Her sister's unwavering support had been her lifeline, when everything else had slipped away. At first, everything was professional. He praised my work publicly, mentioned future promotions. Elena's fingers curled around the edge of the stand. Then he started taking credit for my acquisitions, removing my name from projects I'd developed. When I confronted him privately, he told me that no one would believe me over him, that I should be grateful for the opportunities he was giving me. Lambert maintained his composed expression, but Elena noticed a muscle twitching in his jaw. How many times had she seen that tell before he'd erupted in one of his calculated rages, always careful that no one else was around to witness? "And then?" prompted the prosecutor. Elena squared her shoulders. "Then he began systematically isolating me, spreading rumors about my mental stability, my work ethic. He'd call meetings without me, then claim I'd missed them voluntarily. He'd alter my edits and blame me for the mistakes." As the words flowed from her, Elena felt something shifting inside her chest, the crushing weight of silence finally lifting. 3 years of carrying this burden alone, of doubting herself, was crystallizing into an undeniable truth in this sterile courtroom. "Ms. Vasquez," the prosecutor continued, "can you tell the court about the events of October 15th, 2021? Elena closed her eyes momentarily. When she opened them, they were clear and focused. That was the day I found proof of what he'd been doing. 3 years earlier, Elena had been working late. The Meridian publishing offices nearly deserted as the clock ticked past 9 p.m. Her desk lamp cast a small pool of light in the otherwise darkened editorial department. She'd been poring over advanced math problems for hours, determined to prove her worth, despite Lambert's increasingly blatant sabotage. For months, she'd been gaslit and undermined, watching as projects she'd championed were reassigned, her ideas attributed to others, her concerns dismissed as emotional and unprofessional. Her colleagues had grown distant, carefully avoiding her in the break room and hallways. Even David Torres, who had been her friend since her first day at Meridian, now regarded her with a mixture of pity and wariness. What had once been the proudest achievement of her life, rising from assistant to senior editor despite her working-class background and the subtle biases against her Mexican-American heritage, was being systematically dismantled before her eyes. Elena leaned back in her chair, pressing the heels of her hands against her tired eyes. The headache that had become her constant companion throbbed at her temples. She considered calling Marisol, but decided against it. Her sister had her own struggles dealing with college applications and a part-time job. Elena had always been the strong one, the one who fixed problems, not created them. "You're still here?" The voice startled her. Lambert stood in the doorway, his silk tie loosened, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked perfectly relaxed, as if he hadn't spent the day belittling her in the acquisitions meeting and accidentally leaving her name off the upcoming education schedule. "Just finishing the advanced calculus problem set," Elena replied, instinctively straightening her posture. "The one you asked for by tomorrow morning." Lambert took a slow sip from his glass. "That's what I've always liked about you, Elena. Dedicated, stubborn." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Even when it's clear you're fighting a losing battle." "Is that what this is?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, months of frustration finally boiling over. "A battle? I prefer to think of it as natural selection." He stepped into her office uninvited. "Publishing is changing. Meridian needs a different kind of leadership, a different image." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks. "My test scores outperformed every other student's last quarter." "Numbers," he dismissed with a wave of his hand. "This business is about relationships, Eleanor. About fitting in with the right circles." He gestured vaguely at her with his glass. "Some people just don't have that quality. No fault of their own, of course." Elena swallowed back the words that threatened to spill out. She'd seen Lambert's right circles, the old boys' network that still dominated publishing despite the industry's progressive veneer. The same network that had chosen him, with his mediocre track record but impeccable connections, over more qualified candidates. "If you'll excuse me," she said tightly, "I need to finish this." "Of course." Lambert turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, by the way, I've reassigned the Littleton project to Jeremy. With your current performance issues, I thought it best." The Littleton manuscript was the discovery Eleanor was most proud of that year, a debut novel she'd found in the slush pile and championed through 3 revision rounds. The author had specifically requested to work with her. "You can't do that," she said, rising from her chair. "I found that manuscript. I developed it. The author has been informed of the change and is quite happy with it," Lambert cut in smoothly. "These decisions are ultimately mine to make, Elena. Perhaps if you focused more on your actual responsibilities instead of playing office politics." The accusation was so breathtakingly hypocritical that Elena could only stare at him in disbelief. "I think it might be time to consider whether Meridian is still the right fit for you," he continued, his tone compassionate, while his eyes remained cold. "I'd be happy to provide a reference, but within reason, of course." After he left, Eleanor sat frozen at her desk, hands trembling with rage and fear. Meridian wasn't just a job. It was her identity, her achievement, her proof that all those nights, studying while her classmates partied, all those loan payments, all the times she'd bit her tongue when someone assumed she was the assistant rather than the editor, it had all been worth it. She wouldn't let Lambert take that from her without a fight. On impulse, she opened her email to find the latest correspondence about the Littleton project. She needed to see exactly what Lambert had told the author. As she scrolled through her inbox, she noticed something odd. Emails she was certain she'd sent were missing. Frowning, she checked her sent folder, finding inexplicable gaps in the timeline. A suspicion formed in her mind. At the next computer, Lambert had left his session open, a careless mistake that seemed out of character for someone so calculating. Or perhaps it was the ultimate display of arrogance, believing no one would dare inspect his correspondence. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before sliding into his chair. What she found confirmed her worst fears and revealed horrors she hadn't even imagined. Emails to HR documenting fabricated performance issues, correspondence with other editors encouraging them to report any erratic behavior from Elena, messages to authors misrepresenting her edits and availability. Most damning of all was an email chain with Jeremy, Lambert's favorite, outlining their strategy for pushing Elena out while ensuring she couldn't claim discrimination. "She's playing right into our hands," Lambert had written. "Another month of this, and she'll either quit or have a breakdown. Either way, problem solved, no messy lawsuits." Eleanor's hands shook as she took photos of the emails with her phone, forwarding key messages to her personal account. She felt nauseous, vindicated, and terrified all at once. The systematic campaign against her was laid bare in black and white, but having proof and winning against someone like Lambert were two very different things. She was so absorbed in documenting the evidence that she didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Elena's head snapped up. Lambert stood in the doorway, his earlier facade of civility completely gone. His eyes were chips of ice as they flicked from her to his open email on the screen. "Gathering evidence," she answered, surprising herself with her steadiness, "of everything you've been doing to undermine me." His laugh was short and sharp. "And committing a federal crime in the process, accessing someone else's email without permission. That's going to look fantastic in your termination paperwork." "Termination?" Elena stood, clutching her phone. "You can't fire me for finding evidence of your harassment and discrimination." "Harassment? Discrimination?" Lambert's expression shifted to one of concern, so convincing it momentarily made Elena doubt herself. "Elena, I've been nothing but supportive despite your increasingly paranoid behavior. Ask anyone in the office. They've all noticed your decline." Of course they had. He'd orchestrated it perfectly. Every outburst of frustration, every missed deadline caused by his interference, every confused look when she referred to emails no one had received, all part of the narrative he'd been crafting. "No one's going to believe you," he said softly, almost sympathetically. "A senior executive with an impeccable record, or an editor with a documented history of emotional instability? Do the math, Elena." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Be smart about this. Walk away quietly. I'll even give you severance, 2 months' salary, more than generous considering the circumstances." Elena felt a cold clarity descending over her. This moment, right here, was the crossroads. She could take his offer, walk away with her reputation in tatters but avoid a protracted, painful battle she might not win. Or she could fight, knowing the cost would be enormous. "No," she said simply. Lambert's mask slipped just for a moment, revealing genuine surprise. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by someone he'd already marked as defeated. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "I promise you that." In the courtroom, Eleanor's voice remained steady as she recounted finding the emails, Lambert's threats and what followed. Her termination the next day for computer misuse and unprofessional conduct, the industry-wide whispers that rendered her unemployable, the panic attacks that began to plague her nights and eventually her days as well. "After I was fired, I tried to fight back," she continued. "I sent copies of the emails to HR and the board of directors. They launched an investigation." "And what was the outcome of that investigation?" the prosecutor asked. "They concluded that I had fabricated the emails in an attempt to discredit Mr. Lambert after a negative performance review," Elena replied. "The timestamps had been altered, metadata changed. I was accused of trying to frame him out of spite." She looked directly at Lambert, who met her gaze with perfect composure. "That's when I realized how thorough he'd been, how carefully he'd laid the groundwork. Everyone believed him because he'd spent months making sure they would." The prosecutor approached the bench, submitting a document into evidence. "Ms. Vasquez, are you familiar with this report?" Elena glanced at the paper. "Yes, it's the digital forensics analysis that Detective Collins commissioned after I filed a police report about the harassment." It confirms that the emails were genuine and had been retroactively altered after I forwarded them to myself. And what happened after this forensic evidence came to light? 3 other women came forward with similar experiences, Elena said, all former Meridian employees who'd worked under Mr. Lambert. All had been systematically isolated, gaslighted, and pushed out when they questioned his behavior. She took a deep breath. That's when the district attorney decided there was enough evidence to pursue criminal charges for harassment, workplace intimidation, and digital evidence tampering. As the questioning continued, Elena felt strangely detached, as if watching herself from a distance. The woman on the stand spoke clearly and confidently, presenting facts rather than emotions. She was not the shattered person who had left Meridian 3 years ago, jumping at shadows and doubting her own memories. When the defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his strategy was immediately clear. Paint Elena as unstable, vindictive, incompetent. Each question was a carefully crafted barb designed to make her react emotionally, to undermine her credibility. Ms. Vasquez, isn't it true that you had received a formal warning about your performance 3 months before your termination? Yes, Eleanor acknowledged, after Mr. Lambert became my supervisor and began documenting fabricated issues. And isn't it true that you accessed Mr. Lambert's computer without permission, a violation of company policy? I accessed emails that contained evidence of a campaign to harass and discredit me, Elena replied evenly. Evidence that was subsequently altered to make me appear unstable. Each attack was met with the same calm clarity. Elena had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, working through her trauma with Dr. Wilson, rebuilding her sense of self and truth. The defense attorney grew increasingly frustrated as his attempts to rattle her failed. No further questions, he finally said, returning to his seat with poorly concealed irritation. As Eleanor was dismissed from the stand, she walked past Lambert, feeling his eyes on her, but refusing to give him the satisfaction of her acknowledgement. She had carried the weight of his actions for 3 years. Now it was his turn to bear the consequences. The courtroom doors closed behind her, and Elena leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. Marisol appeared at her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You did it," her sister whispered fiercely. "You stood up there and told your truth, and he couldn't break you." Detective Collins approached, his weathered face creased in a rare smile. "You were magnificent in there, Elena. Rock solid." "Will it be enough?" Elena asked quietly. The fear that had been her constant companion for 3 years couldn't be banished so easily. "The forensic evidence is strong," Collins replied. "And with the other victims' testimony," he shrugged. "Nothing's certain in court, but you've given that bastard something to worry about, that's for sure." As they walked down the courthouse corridor, Elena felt a strange lightness spreading through her chest. For 3 years, she had carried the burden of Lambert's actions, the shame, the self-doubt, the fear. Today, she had set that burden down at last. Outside, spring sunlight bathed the courthouse steps. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the warmth on her face. Whatever the verdict, she had reclaimed her voice, her truth. The weight of silence had finally been lifted, and in its place was something she'd thought Lambert had stolen forever. Hope. "Ready to go home?" Marisol asked gently. Elena opened her eyes and looked out at the city stretching before her, a city where she had once felt powerless and afraid, but which now seemed full of possibilities. "Not yet," she said, surprising herself. I want to enjoy this moment a little longer." She sat down on the courthouse steps, tilting her face toward the sun. For the first time in 3 years, tomorrow didn't feel like something to dread, but something to welcome.